Hello and welcome to another free Teamo8 training video. This is one of the few that we make available for free now. Most of our videos go on the teamo8.com website where you have to be a member to access them. But anyway, what we're going to look at here in this video today is we're going to look at play after the bubble and look at hand ranges and equities. Anyway, let's get right into it here. This player is a fairly new member at Teamo8.com. He comes to the game with a bit of experience. We train players right from the ground up who, maybe they've played quite a bit of Hold'em, but they've never played Omaha high-low in their lives, or they've only played regular Omaha high. But this player actually has had a bit of high-low experience, and some of that shows, actually. So let's get right into it here. So see what happens. Well, actually, I was on the wrong hand. Let's start on the correct hand. So we've pulled up an ace jack 8 deuce on the button, and we're currently sitting in third place. Now, under the gun comes in for a raise 2.5 times. With a hand like that that we've got, most players would jam here. However, it's not an automatic jam. Let's consider what this player would be raising with, given that there's a much shorter stack. He's very close to busting. So for him to be raising down here under the gun against the big stack and against the short stack, who's, as we said, is next in line to bust, then we have to think that this player here must be near the top of his range. Or that his range is certainly a lot stronger than usual to be raising in this situation. So the minimum I would put him on is an ace deuce type hand. So let's have a look at some equities. So here, as we can see, if we think that our opponent is only going to be raising with at least an ace deuce in this situation, then we're pretty much in a coin flipping situation. We've got a jack kicker putting us in a higher part of the ace deuce range. So we scoop about the same amount of times as our opponent. We win the high the same amount of times, but our opponent could possibly be ahead on the low, and that's because we've only got an 8 over here as a backup kicker. So it looks like we're fairly much in a coin flipping situation. Now, so the question is do we want to be coin flipping at this stage of the game when we've got the short stack? Now, our player made the fold, and I can't argue with that. It is very, very close. We've got, although we're probably coin flipping, we're in, there is the overlay in the pot to take that from a chip point of view. But if we consider our tournament equity and we're making an ICM type decision, then folding's not such a bad play there. So yeah, I think our player did reasonably well on that one. But you could also, depending on your style, if you like to play a high variance style, you could also jam that in there. And myself, I tend to play a higher variance style, and so I probably would have jammed. But it's certainly not a huge mistake to be folding in that situation against the raise, because we put the raiser on the higher part of his possible range, given that there's that short stack there. Anyway, let's move along. Okay, we rejoin our player about 18 hands later. He's now coming second out of 3 players. Let's see what happens here. So there's a fold, and our player folds. Now, I'm not going to say that folding there is a mistake, but considering watching this player, he's been playing reasonably tight. So I would expect his calling range, even though he's on the short stack and should call a bit wider, I'd expect his calling range to mainly involve an ace and a small card. Let's see how our equity would stack up against that calling range. So we can see here that we would have about 42% equity against that kind of calling range. But of course, and he'll call us stronger as well, although all the stronger hands like a pair of aces with a small card are included in this range. So we only and our opponents, of course, we only need him to be folding 8% of the time to make this a positive play in terms of chips. So, and he is going to fold at least that amount of the time. So I would say give serious thought to a jam here. Oh, the other thing we look at, sure, we get scooped a bit more often when called, but we're still getting scooped less than half the time. And if that does happen, we're still in the game. Sure, we will drop from second place back to third place. But anyway, I would give consideration to a jam there because I think our opponent, from watching him play, is going to fold often enough to make it a positive play. But it's certainly not a mistake to fold in that situation there. Anyway, let's move along. Okay, we rejoin our player about 9 hands later, and we're now coming second, and we're at heads up. This player down here that we're faced with, he's been playing quite a wide range of hands. He has a really good understanding of his ranges heads up. So anyway, let's have a look at what happens here. So our opponent raises. Our player makes the call, and against the range that this player has been going with, that's not too bad. And then our player jams, and this is a really good play. This is a stop and go. Experienced players will be familiar with this. This is where you're calling pre-flop to then jam on the flop, and the reason for a stop and go, and as opposed to just jamming straight away, even though our hand might have the equity, our opponent's probably going to have the odds to call our jam. So a better play in this situation is often the stop and go, where you call and you're then first to act on the flop, and you jam regardless of what comes. And this is exactly what our player's done. He's jammed. Of course, it's not jamming without any equity at all. If called, he still has a low draw, and with the 5-3 for the low, it's probably not a bad low. Anyway, our opponent folded. So yeah, that's a really nice play, stop and go against a player who's got quite a wide range, and there's no reason at all that he needs to have an ace in his hand to be raising. So that was a good play. Well done. Let's move along. Okay, it's the very next hand. Our player's pulled up a pair of queens with 7 deuce, so we've got some reasonable high and low equity. Let's see what our player does. Okay, and our player folded. I see this quite often, actually. After having made an aggressive play, a player will then tighten up quite a lot on the very next hand. I don't think there was any need to tighten up here. I would have come in for a raise, even just a min raise to double the big blind. Yeah, I would seriously give consideration because, even if called, we're still, there's a lot of flops that are going to be playable with this hand. So, yeah, I probably would have rather have seen a raise in that spot. Anyway, let's move along. Okay, we join our player just 4 hands later. He's got the button this time. Let's see what happens here. So, comes in for a min raise. Gets called. Opponent checks. And our player jams. Now, I don't mind the continuation bet here at all. I don't think there's a lot of risk that our opponent is trapping here with an ace, because he tends to bet whenever he's got something from what we've seen so far, at least in this game. The only thing I would say is, why continuation bet so much? Surely a smaller bet of anywhere from a half to 2/3 of the pot is going to elicit about the same number of folds from our opponent as a jam. Of course, a jam will get slightly more folds, but at these stack sizes, if he has got an ace, he's not going away. Anyway, let's see what happens. Okay, so our opponent made the call with nothing but a low draw. Well, he's got a low draw, and of course he's got a small straight draw as well. So yeah, we were never going to push him off that hand at these sizes. And we got lucky and our opponent didn't hit. So, okay, so our player has chipped up by jamming bottom pair on that board. The thing I would say here is I don't know I don't think that jam was necessary. a smaller bet, our opponent may well have raised, and we, of course, would have folded, so it would have worked out differently in the end if we had played it the way I think it should be played, with a smaller continuation bet. But as played, yeah, I don't mind, but we've got to, after having just pulled the stop and go maneuver a few hands earlier, I'd be very careful now about jamming any boards with a hand like this. We're going to get looked up far more frequently. This player down here does have a good sense. Our opponent does have a good sense of his ranges. So, yeah, I'd just be very careful about these all-in flop bets with not much, doing it too frequently. Anyway, let's move along. Okay, we rejoin our player 8 hands later. He lost the big chip advantage he had. Anyway, let's see what happens here. So he just limps in. I don't mind this at all. I do this myself. I mix up limping, raising quite a bit. Heads up. All right, we didn't really catch much of that flop, so checking back is fine. Our opponent checks, and our player comes out and makes a bet. And that's a really good spot to bet in, regardless of the fact that top card repeated. Top card repeating, of course, makes it a lot easier when you've been checked through twice. That's a great spot to bet. But when an opponent has checked the flop and the turn, I'm going to bet a really high frequency here, because most players won't see that as a bluff, or even if they do, they just, they haven't got the guts to look you up anyway. Most of the time. So what happens here? Our opponent folds, yeah. So yes, when the top card repeats on the turn, that's a great bluffing opportunity. Although, our opponent might say, well, if you didn't have the 10 on the flop, why have we got it now? But at the lower levels, many of our opponents don't think that way, so you can get away with this a lot more frequently. But you don't even need top card to repeat. When you've been checked through twice, you could pretty much bet any turn card there. Anyway, that was well played by our player. Let's move along. And we rejoin our player on the very next hand. Let's see what happens here. So our opponent comes in for a raise, as he's been doing quite a bit. And our player jams with his weak aces. This is a good spot for a 3-bet. This player down here, our opponent's been opening quite wide. And of course, aces always, and was suited, and big kickers, we're always pretty strong on the high hand, so even if called, we're not going to get knocked out too often. So good play from our player there. Anyway, let's move along. And we rejoin our player on the very next hand again. Let's see what happens here. Okay, so he comes in for a limp. As I said, that's okay, especially if your opponent is letting you see a lot of cheap flops, then take them when you've got position on the button. It's not necessary to raise every single hand. Although here, look, I wouldn't have a problem with raising or limping, but I certainly wouldn't fold. That would be a mistake when you've got small connected cards. Okay, so that flop doesn't help us much. Our opponent checks, and our player jams. Now, I can see the logic in jamming here with the straight draw, but we don't want to overdo it. We've done a lot of flop jams against this player. And sooner or later, this player is going to say he's had enough and he's going to call. Excuse me. I would often call, for example, if I had 2 wheel cards and a couple of overcards, I'd be prepared to call in this spot if I was our opponent. Also, if I had a pair, and like if I had a pair of 4s and a 3 deuce, I'd absolutely be calling, because remember, it's far less likely that anyone's hit a paired flop. But anyway, so our player has jammed with the straight draw and a 6-3 for a low. The only thing I would say here, it's not the worst play in the world, but would a smaller bet get the job done? Would just coming out and betting the pot be enough to see our opponent go away? In which case, if we bet pot and he jams on us, then we can consider whether or not a fold is in order, or if we just think that he's on a low draw, we can run through his range of hands then. But always just jamming the flop is going to become a bit transparent if we do it too often. But Again, at the lower levels, I think this is the $3.50 level of the two table sit and goes. So yeah, maybe you can get away with it for a while, but you won't get away with it forever against the same opponent. Anyway, let's move along. Okay, we join our player a few hands later. It's back in a solid position with the chip lead. Let's see how he plays this high only hand. Comes in for a raise. Now, that's a fairly large raise, over 3 times the blind. And like I've said before, I don't mind mixing up raise sizes at all, going from min raised, 2 times to 2.5 times, or even smaller, 2.1 times, 2.2 times, 2.5 times, up to 3 times even. Just so that by mixing up our raise sizes, we make our opponents try to guess what our hand strengths are by doing that. I'm a little concerned that he's chosen a high only hand to make the largest raise. If you make a habit of doing that, of raising bigger on the hands you're less interested in being called with, then that will become readable, and your larger open raises will get jammed more frequently, especially as you move up levels, up to the $7 and the $15 level. Players will spot that and jam over the top of it. But anyway, let's consider the meaning of what raising this much, over 3 times the blind, means should our opponent jam. Let's have a look at some equities. Now, if we consider that our opponent is going to 3-bet only with an ace and a small card, then we'd be left with 43% equity. Now, if he does jam, if you remember the action so far, we'll be faced calling 7,260 into a 12,630 pot, meaning that we need 58% equity to break even. And if our opponent only jams a tight range like that over the top of us, we wouldn't have the necessary equity and would have to fold. But our opponent has a good understanding of ranges, and he plays wider than that, so let's look at some other possibilities. Now, our opponent's certainly shown that he understands the value of the combination of big and small cards, and I think it's quite possible that our opponent would jam back with 2 big cards and 2 wheel cards. Note the interesting thing here. Against this part of his range, we would have 48% equity, and we would be completely indifferent to calling or folding if he jams only this part of his range, because our equity matches exactly with the odds that we're getting. So in the long run, we will break even whether we fold or whether we call. So we don't like making ourselves indifferent in these spots. But of course, that doesn't make up the entire range of our opponent. He does also have some better hands in there. Let's have a look at that. So based on what we've seen from our opponent, this is what I think our opponent's jamming range looks much more like. Any 2 big cards, any 2 small cards. They don't necessarily have to be both wheel cards or even either of them being wheel cards. And we are sitting just under 46% equity against that entire range that it looks like our opponent would jam over the top of us with, which puts us, it's pretty close to the 48% equity that we need. So we're really close to being completely indifferent. Now, and as I said before, what I mean by indifferent is that we make the exact same amount of money by calling as we do by folding in the long run. So in that case, we've put ourselves in a difficult position if our opponent jams at this raise size. However, note what would happen if we raise smaller. Then the equity we would need would go up, because we would be facing a bigger call into the pot, requiring us to have a stronger hand, and we wouldn't be anywhere near close to being indifferent. And the same, by the way, applies if we raised bigger pre-flop. Then we're getting even better odds. So even though our equity is less, we're getting better odds and we can call profitably. But our player here has managed to raise an amount that makes him almost exactly indifferent to calling a jam. So the solution there to prevent yourself from becoming indifferent is to just either raise more, and in this case, to raise much more than this, you'd pretty much have to jam, or raise smaller. And then it makes your folding decision, should your opponent jam, much, much easier. But the one thing you always want to stay away from is raising an amount that, should your opponent jam, that calling and folding will give you the same exact result in terms of chips in the long run. That's what making yourself indifferent is, and it's a really bad spot to be in. Anyway, let's move along. And here we go, we join our player again a few hands later. He's got a nice double suited hand that's reasonably well connected, and of course has the third best starting low. Let's see what happens here. Our opponent jams, and our player makes the call. And that's a really good call, because from what we've seen from our opponent, he's jamming much weaker than what he has just jammed. And we were always going to be pretty darn strong on the low side, and we are. See how it plays out. I don't usually show results, but especially on the free videos. But anyway, our player got lucky and scooped the entire pot. The most likely outcome there, of course, was a split. But anyway, yes, not bad from one of our new players. And the main takeaway points for this player is to think about his bet sizing a little bit more, both pre-flop and on the flop. Otherwise, for two reasons with the flop, not doing the all-in shoves too frequently. Otherwise, they become readable, especially as you move up levels. And also, be very careful about raise sizing pre-flop that leaves you indifferent to a shove. Anyway, if you'd like to know more about what we do in terms of Omaha high-low training, in both sit and goes and MTTs, then check us out on the website at teamo8.com. Anyway, until next time, bye for now.